Hey guys, tonight we're going back to Brazil, 1932, a time when the country was absolutely swimming in coffee, both economically and literally. Imagine entire cities where coffee wasn't just a morning drink, but the main character of the economy. The smell of roasted beans hung in the air like national perfume, and fortunes rose and fell depending on whether people in Europe had the energy to drink one more cup. Now, you'd think a country built on something as delightful as coffee would be peaceful and mellow, like a Sunday morning cafe. But no, in Brazil, coffee didn't just perk people up, it made them downright rebellious. So, who's fighting whom, and why? On one side, you have São Paulo, Brazil's economic powerhouse, home of wealthy coffee barons who think they practically own the country. On the other side is the central government, led by Getúlio Vargas, a man with a vision for a modern, centralized Brazil, and also a knack for making powerful people really angry. The core issue: Vargas came to power after a 1930 revolution and started shaking up politics. Traditionally, São Paulo and Minas Gerais took turns running the country, a system literally called the coffee with milk politics. Cute name, right? Well, Vargas decided to dump milk and coffee both down the drain and instead appoint his own allies. São Paulo felt humiliated and furious coffee barons are not to be underestimated. The spark that lit the powder keg came when Vargas refused to call new elections or appoint São Paulo elites to positions of power. Protests erupted in May 1932, escalating when 4 student protesters, later called the Martyrs of May 23rd, were killed. Their deaths became a rallying cry, and suddenly São Paulo was marching toward rebellion, banners waving, mustaches bristling, and presumably espresso cups clinking defiantly. The consequences were serious. By July 9th, 1932, São Paulo had declared full-scale revolt. What followed was a short but intense civil war that lasted about 3 months, with around 900 deaths and thousands wounded. While the numbers might sound small compared to global wars, for Brazil it was a massive domestic conflict, especially when you consider that many fighters were poorly trained, half-starved, and occasionally too busy arguing about politics to notice they were supposed to be fighting. What makes this war so strangely funny is how disproportionate everything was. São Paulo's rebels expected to sweep the central government aside quickly. But they underestimated Vargas's army, overestimated their own supply chains, and kept accidentally sabotaging themselves. Imagine a military campaign where soldiers are sometimes transported on coffee trains. Propaganda posters promise both democracy and better coffee prices, and at least one battle plan was literally drawn on the back of a coffee sack. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I want to hear from you. Did you know about this battle before? If not, drop a comment after you hear how it really went down. Ready? Let's drop into tonight's story. Things are about to get weird. The whole mess started quietly enough, like a pot of coffee heating up, in the early 1930s. Brazil was still reeling from the Great Depression. Coffee exports had crashed, bankrupting growers and shaking the political system to its core. Vargas, who had come to power after overthrowing the old regime, promised modernization, reforms, and a stronger central government. That sounded great to some Brazilians, especially those outside São Paulo, but to the powerful elites of São Paulo, it sounded like a threat to their entire way of life. These elites weren't just rich, they controlled vast plantations, banks, and industries. Losing political power wasn't an option for them. Behind the scenes, meetings were happening in smoky rooms filled with cigar smoke, maps of railways, and naturally, piles of coffee cups. The rhetoric was heated. One Paulista leader reportedly said, "If we allow Vargas to continue unchecked, soon São Paulo will be nothing but a plantation province." Another replied, "Will not be reduced to footnotes in a government led by some gaucho." The word gaucho here being a jab at Vargas's southern roots. Brazilians take regional pride seriously, and apparently, it can start wars. Meanwhile, Vargas wasn't exactly sitting back sipping tea. He began strengthening the federal army, positioning loyal generals, and even sending troops into São Paulo under the guise of peacekeeping. This, unsurprisingly, only poured more caffeine into the rebellion pot. By early 1932, tensions were boiling over. One particularly bizarre fact in some Sao Paulo neighborhoods, people started stockpiling coffee not just to drink, but to use as makeshift barricades. Coffee sacks were stacked like sandbags on street corners, ready to block federal troops. Historians still debate whether this was mostly symbolic or if someone genuinely thought bullets couldn't penetrate bags of beans. Either way, it made for very aromatic street fighting later on. As tensions escalated, secret rebel militias began forming, often made up of young men who had more enthusiasm than military training. They called themselves Constitutionalists because their stated goal was to restore constitutional rule. But honestly, many were just angry about being pushed around by Vargas's allies. By June, Sao Paulo was practically a state preparing for war while still pretending it wasn't. Railroads were quietly requisitioned, officers were recruited in back alleys, and propaganda leaflets fluttered across the city like caffeine-charged butterflies. Then came July 9th, the official outbreak of hostilities. The rebels struck first, seizing key positions in Sao Paulo City and declaring that they would march on Rio de Janeiro to overthrow Vargas. Crowds cheered, church bells rang, and coffee cups clinked in celebratory toasts. It was dramatic, historic, and though no one knew it yet, totally doomed. Vargas's forces were larger, better equipped, and far more experienced. Plus, they had control of the national treasury, which is always handy when you need to buy bullets. But for now, the rebels were euphoric. They believed Sao Paulo's cause was just and that other states would rise up in solidarity. Rebel leaders sent telegrams to Minas Gerais, Rio Grande do Sul, and other regions, confidently expecting replies like, "We're with you, let's topple Vargas together instead." Most of those replies were variations of "good luck with that," "we're sitting this one out," or, in the case of Minas Gerais, a polite "absolutely not," light. Still, the Paulista army marched out with banners flying, officers shouting orders, and plenty of horses looking deeply unimpressed by the whole affair. The war had officially begun, and Brazil was about to discover that a country built on coffee can also run on chaos. In the beginning, Sao Paulo's rebellion looked like a confident gamble, but the reality was more like a drunk game of poker played with soggy cards. The elites who had been loudly promising victory suddenly found themselves needing to deliver actual soldiers, actual rifles, and actual money. It's one thing to say, "We will march to Rio and topple Vargas," and another to realize you have to somehow feed, arm, and coordinate thousands of volunteers who think strategy is just run at them and hope. The early weeks of July were a blur of frantic preparation. Factories that usually produced farm equipment were hastily converted to churn out weapons and ammunition. Sewing shops that once made fancy suits now stitched military uniforms. And warehouses filled with coffee sacks were repurposed to store supplies, though occasionally the wrong bags got shipped to the front lines, leading to tragicomic moments where rebel fighters opened crates expecting rifles and instead found espresso beans. The joke on the front became, well, if the bullets run out, at least we can keep fighting with caffeine. The rebels weren't entirely disorganized. They had some capable officers and, perhaps more importantly, a whole lot of enthusiasm. Men volunteered by the thousands, driven by anger at Vargas and a romantic vision of defending Sao Paulo's honor. There were even teenagers and university students among the ranks, marching off to war with shiny boots and way too much optimism. A Sao Paulo newspaper at the time printed a photo of these young recruits under the headline, "The Future of the Republic." Someone later scribbled in the margins, "or at least the future of our coffee shops." Vargas, of course, wasn't just sitting in Rio waiting for the rebellion to come knocking. The moment the revolt began, he mobilized federal troops with cold efficiency. Unlike the rebels, Vargas's army had consistent supplies, better training, and this is crucial railroad access that actually worked. While Sao Paulo was still arguing about who controlled which railway junction, Vargas was already shipping whole divisions north and south to encircle the rebel stronghold. One curious fact about this war is how much of it revolved around Brazil's railways. The entire country was stitched together by trains, and whoever controlled the tracks controlled troop movements. Sao Paulo's rebels had assumed they could easily dominate their local rail network. But federal forces quickly seized key junctions, cutting off supplies and isolating rebel units in some places. Battles were literally fought on the train tracks themselves. Witnesses described scenes of steam engines abandoned mid-battle while soldiers fired from between the cars, as though someone had accidentally turned a transportation hub into a spaghetti western. Meanwhile, the rebel leadership in São Paulo was becoming increasingly desperate. They had expected other states to join their cause, but those hoped-for allies remained stubbornly neutral. Minas Gerais, the milk half of the old Coffee and Milk Alliance, had been counted on to rise up in support. Instead, Minas's leaders calculated that siding with Vargas was safer and, frankly, less likely to get their cities bombed. This betrayal stung deeply. One rebel general supposedly threw a coffee cup at a wall upon hearing the news and yelled, "So much for our sacred partnership, the cup broke," and so did his faith in alliances. This political isolation forced the rebels into a defensive posture far sooner than they'd planned. Originally, they had dreamed of marching on Rio de Janeiro in a triumphant offensive. Now, they were struggling just to hold São Paulo itself. Vargas's federal troops were pressing in from 3 directions, supported by artillery and even a fledgling air force. Planes flew overhead, dropping bombs, sometimes accurately, sometimes not so much. One particularly infamous incident involved a federal pilot accidentally bombing a field of coffee plants instead of rebel trenches, sparking rumors that Vargas's real strategy was to destroy São Paulo's economy bean by bean. On the home front, civilian morale was shaky at best. At first, there was widespread excitement. Crowds cheered parades of soldiers, women sewed flags and bandages, and newspapers printed fiery editorials about liberty and justice. But as the war dragged on and federal troops drew closer, enthusiasm began to fade. Food shortages hit the city, rationing was imposed, and people started realizing that war is a lot less glamorous when you can't get sugar for your morning coffee. One bizarre piece of trivia from this time involves São Paulo's street cats. With food supplies dwindling, city dwellers began feeding cats leftover coffee grounds mixed with scraps just to keep them alive. This led to tales of jittery, hyperactive cats racing through alleyways like tiny, caffeinated soldiers. Historians still debate whether this is true or just wartime urban legend, but either way, it became part of local folklore. Back at the front lines, the fighting intensified through late July. Rebel units dug trenches along key approaches to the city, fortifying themselves with whatever materials they had on hand. This included actual fortifications made of coffee sacks, which became a bizarre symbol of the conflict. Federal soldiers joked that they were fighting the most delicious barricades in history. The rebels did score some early victories. In one skirmish near Bury, they managed to ambush a federal column, capturing supplies and forcing a retreat. It was a morale boost, briefly convincing São Paulo's leaders that maybe, just maybe, they could hold out until international pressure forced Vargas to negotiate. Some rebels even fantasized about foreign intervention. One politician suggested appealing to the United States, saying, "Americans love coffee, surely they'll come save us." This idea was quickly shot down when someone pointed out that the US spy was dealing with the Great Depression and probably wasn't going to send troops just to protect Brazil's espresso exports. By August, cracks were showing in the rebel cause, logistics were collapsing, ammunition was running low, and rifles were so scarce that some recruits were given wooden sticks for training, with the promise that real guns would arrive soon. One bitter soldier quipped, "We're ready to fight for our rights just as soon as we find bullets." Federal propaganda added insult to injury. Vargas's government blanketed the countryside with leaflets portraying the rebels as spoiled coffee lords trying to preserve their old privileges. These leaflets often contained crude cartoons of fat barons sipping lattes while ordinary Brazilians suffered. The messaging was simple but effective. Fight for Brazil, not for their cappuccinos. It stung, partly because it wasn't entirely untrue. As August wore on, the balance of power shifted decisively toward Vargas. Federal forces were closing in on all sides, and São Paulo's dream of a glorious march to Rio now seemed like a cruel joke. Still, the rebels weren't ready to give up. They dug in, brewed more coffee, and prepared to make a last stand, unaware of just how bitter their final cup was going to taste. By early August, the rebels' confidence was starting to curdle like spoiled milk and bad coffee. The initial cheers and patriotic speeches had given way to frantic logistical nightmares. São Paulo had expected a clean, elegant uprising like a well-poured espresso shot. Instead, it was turning into a lukewarm mess of delays, shortages, and constant arguments about who was in charge. The leadership of the revolt wasn't exactly unified. There were politicians who wanted to negotiate, generals who wanted to charge ahead, and coffee barons who mostly wanted to make sure their plantations didn't get torched. At one meeting, a frustrated colonel supposedly slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "Are we here to win a war or to argue over seating arrangements?" Nobody had an answer, but everyone agreed it was probably both. Meanwhile, Vargas's federal government was moving like a well-oiled machine, or at least more well-oiled than the rebels. Supplies flowed into federal camps with military precision. While São Paulo's forces were improvising on the fly, one historian later described the situation like this: Vargas fought with rifles. São Paulo fought with enthusiasm. Enthusiasm is great for a school play, but not so much when you're facing artillery. One of the strangest aspects of the conflict was how heavily it relied on Brazil's existing coffee trade infrastructure. Warehouses, rail depots, and even coffee sacks themselves became part of the war effort. Rebels transported ammunition in the same trains that once carried beans, and in some cases, they actually hid weapons inside coffee shipments to sneak them past federal checkpoints. There are stories, possibly exaggerated, of federal soldiers accidentally brewing coffee with gunpowder because the supplies had been mislabeled. The rebels were also struggling with money. Funding a war is expensive, and São Paulo had fewer resources than the federal government. At one point, rebel leaders began issuing their own currency, printed in a rush and backed by promises rather than gold. This new money quickly became known as caffeine cash by locals. Some merchants accepted it, while others refused, leading to awkward conversations like, "I'm sorry, sir, but your funny coffee money won't buy this loaf of bread." Federal propaganda was relentless and clever. Vargas's government had a knack for framing the rebellion as the selfish tantrum of wealthy elites. Newspapers under federal control ran cartoons showing top-hatted coffee barons sipping fancy drinks while poor Brazilians suffered. Radio broadcasts mocked the rebels, even playing satirical songs about their supposed incompetence. One popular tune had a chorus that went something like, "They march on empty stomachs and dream of empty cups." It was catchy and infuriating for the rebels. São Paulo responded with its own propaganda, which was less effective. Their posters featured heroic imagery of soldiers defending democracy, but they didn't quite connect with ordinary citizens. One particularly infamous poster promised, "Victory means freedom and cheaper coffee." This backfired spectacularly when people started asking whether the war was really about democracy or just their morning brew. On the battlefield, the fighting was becoming more intense. Federal troops were pressing in from multiple directions, forcing the rebels into a shrinking defensive ring around São Paulo City. Skirmishes erupted along rail lines, with both sides fighting over bridges and tunnels like they were priceless treasures. In some places, the combat was so close that soldiers on opposing sides could hear each other yelling insults or song lyrics from across the tracks. The rebels did manage a few clever maneuvers. In one operation, they blew up a section of railway just before a federal train full of reinforcements arrived. The train derailed harmlessly into a field, and the federal soldiers were forced to continue on foot through rough terrain. It was a small victory, but it gave the rebels a temporary morale boost. Unfortunately, the celebration didn't last long. Federal engineers had the tracks repaired within days, and the same train route was soon operational again. Meanwhile, the Federal Air Force was starting to make its presence felt, though primitive by modern standards. These planes were terrifying to rebel troops who had never faced aerial bombardment before. The bombers weren't always accurate, sometimes hitting empty fields or the occasional unlucky cow, but when they did hit, the psychological impact was immense. Rebel soldiers began joking grimly that they were fighting both Vargas and gravity at the same time. Civilians were caught in the middle of all this chaos. Many tried to flee the combat zones, crowding onto trains and carts with whatever belongings they could carry. Others stayed behind, either out of loyalty to São Paulo or because they simply had nowhere to go. Stories emerged of families hiding in basements while battles raged in the streets above. The smell of gunpowder mixing with the ever-present scent of coffee. A particularly strange episode involved a group of rebel soldiers who stumbled upon a federal supply depot stocked with canned food, rifles, and boots. Overjoyed, they decided to loot the supplies and take them back to their unit, but instead of leaving immediately, they stopped to brew coffee over a campfire, reasoning that they deserved a hot drink before the journey. This delay gave federal troops enough time to counterattack, forcing the rebels to abandon most of the supplies. It became a running joke among federal officers. All we need to beat them is give them a coffee break. As August dragged on, the rebels' hopes of external support grew dimmer. They had been counting on international sympathy, perhaps even foreign aid. But the rest of the world was busy dealing with its own problems, like the lingering effects of the Great Depression. The League of Nations issued some polite statements about peace and democracy, but no one was sending ships or soldiers. One rebel leader bitterly remarked, "We are alone, just us and our beans." Historians still debate whether the rebellion could have succeeded if other states had joined in. Some argue that a coordinated uprising across Brazil might have overwhelmed Vargas. Others believe that federal forces were simply too strong and too well organized to be defeated at that moment. What's clear is that São Paulo miscalculated badly, expecting allies who never arrived and a quick victory that never came. By late August, the mood in São Paulo was grim. Food was running out, morale was collapsing, and federal troops were tightening their grip like a slowly closing fist. Still, the rebels weren't ready to surrender just yet. They were determined to fight on, even if their cause was looking more like a tragic comedy than a noble crusade. By the first days of September, the rebellion had lost its shine. What had begun as a dramatic stand for constitutional rights was now a grueling war of attrition, and São Paulo was running low on everything except coffee and frustration. The grand strategy of marching to Rio de Janeiro was long dead. Instead, the rebels were fighting to keep their own city from falling, clinging to defensive lines like a stubborn barista refusing to admit that the milk had gone sour. The reality on the ground was chaotic. Commanders issued orders that often contradicted each other. Supply trains vanished into thin air, and entire battalions sometimes wandered in the wrong direction because no one had a proper map. One particularly tragicomic incident involved a group of rebel fighters who spent 2 days guarding what they thought was a vital bridge, only to discover it was an abandoned logging platform. When their commander asked why they hadn't noticed sooner, one soldier muttered, "Well, sir, the fog was very patriotic." Federal troops were steadily tightening the noose. Vargas's generals knew how to play the long game, rather than launching reckless frontal assaults. They methodically cut off rail lines, seized depots, and surrounded key strongholds. Every week, São Paulo's territory shrank a little more, like coffee evaporating in a pot left too long on the stove. By now, the federal army had nearly double the manpower of the rebels, and their supplies seemed endless by comparison. The rebels tried to compensate with creativity. Improvised weapons became a hallmark of the conflict. Farmers contributed homemade bombs crafted from fertilizer and scrap metal. Mechanics converted trucks into makeshift armored cars by bolting on sheets of iron and even old boilerplates. These vehicles were terrifying to look at, but mechanically questionable. There's an account of one rebel tank that rattled so loudly it could be heard 2 miles away, giving federal troops plenty of time to prepare an ambush. Perhaps the most absurd battlefield innovation involved using actual coffee sacks as camouflage. Rebel snipers reportedly draped themselves in burlap coffee bags to blend into rural terrain. It didn't work very well, turns out a lumpy, coffee-scented bush isn't very convincing, but the rebels took pride in the symbolism. "We fight for coffee. We fight with coffee," one sniper supposedly quipped, just before being spotted and forced to retreat. As federal forces advanced, they also began experimenting with aerial tactics. By mid-September, small bombers and reconnaissance planes were a regular presence in the skies over São Paulo. These planes were primitive by modern standards, but their psychological effect was immense. Civilians ducked at the sound of engines, and rebel soldiers cursed every time they saw a glint of sunlight on wings. Federal pilots weren't always accurate, though. One infamous raid accidentally bombed a herd of cattle instead of a rebel encampment. Locals claimed the surviving cows were so traumatized they refused to cross open fields for weeks. The rebels attempted their own aerial operations, but they had only a handful of planes, most of them old, creaky, and barely airworthy. One pilot reportedly carried a hammer in the cockpit to fix the engine mid-flight, which doesn't inspire much confidence. Despite these limitations, the rebels managed a few daring raids, including one where they dropped homemade bombs on a federal ammunition train. The explosions were spectacular, though the pilot admitted later that he nearly fainted from the fumes of his leaking fuel tank. Back in the city, daily life had become surreal. Civilians were living under martial law, rationing food and supplies. Coffee itself, ironically, was one of the few things still abundant. People joked that while they might starve, at least they wouldn't fall asleep. Makeshift coffee stands sprang up near defensive lines, serving strong brews to exhausted soldiers. In a war fought over coffee, caffeine became both weapon and comfort. A particularly bizarre trivia nugget comes from a small town outside São Paulo. When federal troops approached, local villagers decided to welcome them with a peace offering a giant pot of coffee. The soldiers, touched by the gesture, stopped to drink before continuing their advance. This delay gave a nearby rebel unit just enough time to slip away and avoid capture. To this day, the town celebrates an annual festival called the Coffee Truce, complete with reenactments of soldiers politely sipping before resuming hostilities. As September dragged on, the rebels' desperation grew. Commanders began sending frantic telegrams begging for reinforcements and supplies that never came. Ammunition was so scarce that soldiers were sometimes ordered to conserve bullets by firing only at close range. One grizzled veteran summed it up bitterly: "We aim carefully because every bullet is worth its weight in beans." Meanwhile, Vargas played the political game masterfully. He offered amnesty to rebel soldiers who defected, promising they would be treated fairly if they laid down their arms. Some accepted, slipping away under cover of darkness to surrender. Others fought on, fueled by pride, stubbornness, or sheer rage. The rebellion's leadership tried to maintain morale with speeches about honor and democracy, but those words rang hollow as federal artillery shells rained down on the city. Historians still debate a key question. Was there ever a realistic path to victory for São Paulo? Some argue that if other states had joined in, Vargas might have been forced to negotiate. Others believe the federal government's superior resources meant the rebellion was doomed from the start. What's certain is that by mid-September, the outcome was clear. The only question left was how long São Paulo could hold out and how much suffering its people would endure before the final surrender. The mood in the city turned somber. Streets were empty except for patrols and scavengers. Civilians huddled in basements, listening to the distant boom of artillery. Even the ever-present smell of coffee seemed bitter now, a reminder of dreams gone cold. As one weary shopkeeper told a reporter, "We thought we were fighting for freedom. Now we just fight to see another morning." In those dark days, the rebellion's leaders faced a terrible choice: continue a hopeless fight or seek terms from Vargas. Some urged negotiation, arguing that prolonging the war would only bring more destruction. Others insisted on fighting to the last man. The debates were fierce, sometimes nearly violent. One politician reportedly shouted, "Better to drown in coffee than to kneel before Vargas," to which another replied dryly, "Well, we're certainly drowning in something." By late September, it was clear that the end was near. The federal army was closing in from all sides, and no miracles were coming. São Paulo's last gamble would soon be played, and everyone knew the odds were terrible. By mid-September, the rebellion had transformed into a grim waiting game. The federal army was closing in, and São Paulo's defenses were stretched thinner than a cheap coffee filter. Every day brought new reports of rail lines being seized, supply depots captured, and rebel positions collapsing like badly stacked cups. The war that had once been about deals and politics now felt like a desperate fight for survival, and for some, just a fight for breakfast. Logistics became the defining problem of the rebellion. The rebels had plenty of men willing to fight, but no reliable way to move them around. Most of Brazil's infrastructure had been built for the coffee trade, not war. Trains were supposed to carry beans, not battalions, and they weren't exactly designed to do both at the same time. Rebel officers would commandeer locomotives, load them with soldiers, and send them racing toward the front lines, only to discover the tracks ahead were controlled by federal forces. Sometimes the trains would stop just short of enemy positions and unload troops directly into firefights. Other times, they would have to reverse and flee at full speed, creating scenes that looked more like slapstick comedy than serious warfare. One particularly ridiculous episode occurred when a rebel commander ordered a night train loaded with ammunition to slip through federal lines under cover of darkness. The plan was daring and, on paper, brilliant in practice. The train's engineer accidentally blew the whistle as they crossed a bridge, alerting every federal soldier within miles. The resulting battle lasted until dawn, and the train was eventually captured along with all the precious ammunition it carried. The rebels dubbed it the Night of the Singing Train, though no one found it very funny at the time. Coffee shipments also played a bizarre role in the conflict. While soldiers fought in the countryside, merchants in São Paulo City were still trying to keep the coffee business running, believing the war would end quickly. This led to surreal moments where trains carrying troops would pass trains carrying beans going in the opposite direction. In one case, a mix-up caused an entire shipment of coffee to be sent to the front lines instead of food and medical supplies. The soldiers were furious at first, but after brewing a few strong cups, they admitted it wasn't the worst mistake ever. Federal forces, meanwhile, had no such logistical chaos. They moved methodically, using their superior rail network to reinforce positions and maintain a steady flow of supplies. They even used armored trains, literal fortresses on wheels equipped with cannons and machine guns. When one of these behemoths rolled into a contested rail junction, the rebels scattered like startled pigeons. A captured soldier later described the experience. It was like watching a castle come to life, except the castle was on fire and trying to kill you. In São Paulo City, civilian life had descended into something halfway between wartime hardship and dark comedy. Rationing was now severe. Meat, sugar, and flour were in short supply, but coffee was everywhere. People drank it morning, noon, and night, often on empty stomachs. As one weary mother told a journalist, "My children have been awake for 3 days straight, but at least they're alert." The city's trams became symbols of the war's absurdity, with fuel scarce. Horses were sometimes hitched to trams to keep them moving. This led to bizarre scenes of modern streetcars being pulled by bewildered animals, while passengers argued about politics inside. Federal propaganda artists had a field day with these images, producing cartoons that mocked São Paulo as a place stuck between the 19th and 20th centuries. Federal planes were now bombing rebel positions almost daily. Their aim wasn't always precise, but the psychological impact was devastating. São Paulo soldiers would dive for cover at the sound of engines, even when no bombs fell. In one odd incident, a pilot accidentally dropped his own lunch wrapped in a cloth bundle over rebel lines. The rebels panicked, thinking it was a bomb, only to discover it contained a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. They ate the sandwich, drank the coffee, and declared it the only successful supply drop of the war. As the situation worsened, the rebels tried increasingly desperate measures. They attempted to build makeshift barricades using everything from furniture to overturned trams. At one key intersection, they even piled up hundreds of coffee sacks, creating a wall that smelled amazing but stopped very few bullets. Federal troops joked that the barricade was delicious to look at and easy to burn. Leadership squabbles also intensified. São Paulo's politicians clashed constantly with its generals. The politicians wanted to preserve the city and minimize civilian suffering, while the generals pushed for bold military action even if it meant heavy losses. In one infamous meeting, a general slammed his sword on the table and declared, "Better to die on our feet than live on our knees." A politician calmly replied, "Better to negotiate on our knees than die without breakfast." Neither side was persuaded. Amid all this chaos, rumors spread like wildfire. One persistent story claimed that Vargas himself had disguised as a soldier to spy on rebel positions. Another rumor said foreign powers were secretly sending aid, though no one ever saw evidence of this. Historians still debate whether these rumors were spontaneous or deliberately planted by federal agents to demoralize the rebels. By late September, the Federal Army controlled most of the surrounding countryside. Rebel forces were now concentrated in a shrinking pocket around São Paulo City. Artillery bombardments became a daily reality, shaking buildings and rattling nerves. Civilians dug trenches in their backyards for shelter. Shops closed, churches filled with frightened families, and even the once bustling coffee houses fell silent. Yet amidst the despair, there were moments of dark humor. One day, a stray dog wandered onto the front lines carrying a stick in its mouth. Both sides momentarily stopped shooting to watch it trot across no man's land, oblivious to the war around it. A federal soldier later remarked, "That dog was the bravest thing I saw all month." It was becoming clear to everyone, including the rebels themselves, that the war could not continue much longer. São Paulo was isolated, exhausted, and starving. Vargas held all the cards. The only thing left to decide was whether the final act would be a negotiated surrender or a catastrophic last stand. As September faded into October, both sides prepared for the endgame. The question on every mind was simple. Would São Paulo's leaders swallow their pride and save their city, or would they fight to the bitter, bean-flavored end? By October, the war had become a contest of exhaustion. Both sides were battered, but only one had the reserves to keep fighting. Vargas's federal forces kept arriving like a steady tide. While Sao Paulo's rebellion was reduced to frantic improvisation, what had once been a confident uprising now resembled a comedy of errors performed with live ammunition. The Federal Army's advances were deliberate and disciplined. They captured one rail junction after another, slowly strangling the rebellion's supply lines. Without rails, São Paulo couldn't move troops, food, or weapons effectively. Every time the rebels tried to send a train through, it risked being intercepted or blown to pieces. Entire locomotives were abandoned mid-route, their cargo left for federal troops to seize. One captured engineer allegedly told his captors, "We didn't lose the train, we just accidentally changed ownership mid-trip." Faced with this relentless pressure, the rebels turned to increasingly absurd strategies. They began using coffee shipments to smuggle ammunition past federal checkpoints. It almost worked until federal soldiers noticed that some sacks seemed unusually heavy. When they cut one open, instead of beans, they found rifles wrapped in burlap. The officer in charge reportedly remarked, "Ah, so this is what they mean by a strong brew." The Federal Air Force was now a constant menace. Their planes were primitive and prone to mechanical failure, but they didn't need precision to terrorize the rebels. Even a near miss could scatter troops and destroy morale. Rebel soldiers learned to dive for cover at the first buzzing sound overhead, which occasionally led to embarrassing false alarms. There's a documented incident where an entire company of rebels panicked and fled from what turned out to be a flock of geese. Meanwhile, the rebels' own air capabilities were laughable. They had a handful of aging biplanes, many of which looked ready to fall apart in midair. Mechanics often had to push the planes down the runway by hand just to get them airborne. In one desperate mission, a rebel pilot dropped leaflets instead of bombs, pleading with federal troops to defect. The leaflets were printed on coffee paper stock, which made them smell faintly of espresso. Some federal soldiers kept them as souvenirs, joking that it was the best-smelling surrender request in history. On the ground, the Federal Army introduced a terrifying new weapon, the armored train. These massive machines bristled with guns and could rumble through rebel positions like mobile fortresses. When one first appeared outside the city of Campinas, rebel defenders were so shocked that they initially mistook it for some kind of bizarre parade float. By the time they realized it wasn't there to celebrate, it had already blasted a hole in their defenses. Rebel ingenuity, however, was not entirely dead. In response to the armored trains, Sao Paulo engineers devised a series of improvised explosive traps along rail lines. One such device involved hollowing out coffee sacks, filling them with dynamite, and disguising them as part of a normal shipment. The plan worked once, spectacularly, derailing a federal train and creating a crater large enough to swallow a horse. Unfortunately, federal troops quickly caught on and began inspecting every coffee shipment with exaggerated suspicion. Propaganda became a weapon as potent as any rifle. Federal broadcasts portrayed the rebels as spoiled elites fighting to preserve their cushy lifestyles. They painted Vargas as the champion of the common people, standing firm against selfish barons. Rebel propaganda, by contrast, tried to appeal to national pride and constitutional principles. Unfortunately, their messaging was often undermined by reality. It was hard to convince starving civilians that this was a noble fight for democracy when their children were fainting from hunger. In São Paulo City, daily life reached surreal levels of absurdity. With food shortages worsening, people turned to strange substitutes. Bread was baked with ground-up coffee husks. Soup was made from whatever scraps could be skinched. There's even a documented case of a bakery experimenting with coffee bread, a loaf baked entirely from ground beans and water. The taste was described as deeply alarming, but desperate citizens ate it anyway. Civilians developed a grim sense of humor to cope. Graffiti appeared on walls mocking both sides. One popular slogan read, "Vargas gives us bombs, the rebels give us speeches, and no one gives us lunch." Another simply read, "Wake me when it's over." Amidst the suffering, small acts of kindness stood out. A group of nuns opened their convent to house orphans and wounded soldiers from both sides. When asked how they could remain neutral, the Mother Superior reportedly said, "God doesn't take sides in coffee politics." As October wore on, rebel leaders realized they were nearing the end. Federal forces had surrounded São Paulo City entirely. Artillery bombardments were constant, turning once proud neighborhoods into rubble. The city's iconic coffee warehouses now stood gutted and burned, their aromatic contents scattered across the streets like bitter confetti. Historians still debate whether there was a moment when surrender could have been negotiated earlier. Some argue that Vargas deliberately prolonged the siege to break São Paulo's spirit completely. Others believe the rebels themselves were too divided and proud to accept reasonable terms until it was far too late. Inside the rebel command, tensions boiled over. Some officers begged for a ceasefire, warning that continued resistance would only lead to pointless deaths. Others insisted on fighting to the last man. One particularly heated argument ended with a general storming out of the room and shouting, "If we must fall, let us fall caffeinated and proud." His aide quietly followed him out and whispered, "Sir, we ran out of coffee this morning." By mid-October, Vargas issued an ultimatum: unconditional surrender or total destruction. The rebels hesitated, torn between pride and pragmatism, but even the most stubborn leaders could see the truth. The rebellion was finished. The only question left was whether they would sign the papers before the city itself was obliterated. As negotiations began, ordinary soldiers on both sides prepared for the final chapter. Some cleaned their rifles one last time. Others simply sat in silence, staring into tin cups of bitter, black coffee. The end was near, and everyone knew it would leave a taste Brazil would never forget. As October rolled deeper into its final weeks, the war began to resemble less of a battle for ideals and more of a bizarre endurance contest which side could stay awake. Fed and functional the longest, the federal forces had the upper hand in all three categories, while São Paulo's rebels were basically running on fumes and, of course, coffee. Vargas's troops moved like clockwork now. Every day, they pushed the lines forward, surrounding São Paulo a little tighter. Federal generals didn't need to rush. Time itself was their greatest weapon. The city was isolated, its railways cut, its supply depots captured. The federal army knew that if they just kept the pressure steady, São Paulo would eventually break apart from hunger and exhaustion. It was the military equivalent of waiting for a stubborn pot of coffee to finally boil over. The rebels, meanwhile, were resorting to desperate theatrics to keep morale from completely collapsing. They staged military parades inside the city to convince civilians they were still strong. These parades were mostly smoke and mirrors, soldiers marching in circles to look like new reinforcements, banners recycled from earlier battles, and bands playing patriotic songs loud enough to drown out the distant federal artillery. It didn't really fool anyone. Civilians saw through the charade, and federal pilots flying overhead certainly weren't impressed. One pilot reportedly radioed back to base. "They're playing drums and waving flags. Should we drop bombs or just applause?" Food shortages were now catastrophic. Entire neighborhoods were living on little more than coffee and scraps, with meat unavailable and bread scarce. People turned to bizarre substitutes. Historians have accounts of coffee soup, a grim mixture of boiled beans, stale water, and a pinch of salt. There were also tales of families roasting green coffee beans like chestnuts, chewing them slowly as if that might trick their stomachs into feeling full. Ironically, caffeine itself became a double-edged sword. It kept people awake and alert, but with no real food to balance it. The population was jittery, irritable, and prone to wild rumors. Arguments would flare up in bread lines over the tiniest misunderstandings. One story tells of a near riot breaking out because someone claimed to have seen a federal soldier disguised as a baker. By the time authorities intervened, it turned out the soldier was just a tired man in an apron who happened to stand too straight. On the front lines, desperation bred innovation. Rebel fighters began constructing elaborate defensive positions using whatever materials they could scavenge broken furniture, bricks from ruined buildings, even dismantled tram cars. One fortification was nicknamed Fort Sofa because it was literally built out of couches stacked 3 high. Federal soldiers joked that if they captured it, they'd sit down and take a nap. But humor couldn't disguise the growing imbalance. Vargas's forces were now deploying heavy artillery with ruthless efficiency. Massive guns pounded rebel positions day and night, turning trenches into mud pits and sending defenders scrambling. The sound was so constant that residents of São Paulo started comparing it to an endless thunderstorm, except this storm came with shrapnel instead of rain. Federal bombers added to the chaos. Though still primitive, their raids were increasingly coordinated. By now, the federal pilots had learned the layout of the city well enough to hit important targets with eerie precision. Rebel headquarters had to move constantly, sometimes changing locations 3 times in a single day to avoid being bombed. It became a deadly game of hide and seek, with lives on the line. In one of the most infamous episodes of the entire war, a federal plane mistakenly dropped a bomb on a warehouse filled entirely with coffee sacks. The explosion sent roasted beans raining down across several city blocks. For a brief, surreal moment, the streets were covered in what locals later described as the most expensive snowfall in history. Civilians rushed out to collect the beans, risking their lives amid the falling debris. Even amidst war, nobody was willing to let good coffee go to waste. Meanwhile, federal propaganda was in full swing. Leaflets rained from the sky, promising amnesty and fair treatment to any rebels who surrendered. Radio broadcasts urged soldiers to come home to their families instead of dying for wealthy barons. These messages struck a nerve. Rebel defections began to increase, with small groups slipping across the lines under cover of darkness. The rebel leadership tried to counter this psychological warfare, but their own propaganda was sounding increasingly hollow. Speeches about democracy and honor rang false when delivered to hungry, exhausted soldiers who hadn't been paid in weeks. In one notorious incident, a rebel general delivered a rousing speech about sacrificing for the motherland, only to be interrupted by a soldier shouting, "The motherland owes me breakfast." The outburst sparked laughter and a quiet sense of despair. Behind closed doors, the political leaders of the rebellion were divided. Some pushed for immediate negotiations, arguing that surrender could save countless lives. Others clung stubbornly to the dream of victory, convinced that if they just held out a little longer, other states might rise up or foreign powers might intervene. These debates grew so heated that they occasionally devolved into physical scuffles. Historians still debate this period intensely. Could São Paulo have negotiated better terms if they'd acted sooner? Was Vargas genuinely interested in reconciliation? Or did he deliberately drag things out to crush his enemies completely? No one knows for certain, though surviving records suggest that Vargas was both patient and ruthlessly strategic. As federal troops encircled the city completely, the rebels made one last, desperate attempt to break the siege. In a nighttime operation, they launched a surprise attack on a federal supply line, hoping to seize food and ammunition. At first, it seemed to work. They captured several wagons and scattered the guards. But in their haste, they overloaded the wagons with loot, making them too heavy to move quickly. Federal reinforcements arrived before the rebels could retreat, turning the raid into a disaster. A survivor later described it bitterly: "We fought like lions, and we fled like donkeys." By late October, the writing was on the wall, literally. Civilians began painting messages on walls begging the rebels to surrender. One particularly haunting message read, "Better to lose today than starve tomorrow." Inside the rebel command center, even the most die-hard leaders could no longer ignore reality. The rebellion was collapsing. The only decision left was whether to surrender with dignity or let the city burn around them. And yet, even in those final hours, some refused to accept defeat. One general famously declared, "I would rather drown in coffee than bow to Vargas." His aide quietly replied, "Sir, at this point, we don't even have coffee." The end was near and everyone knew it. By late October, São Paulo had been transformed into a city under siege in every sense of the word. Once a bustling hub of commerce and coffee trade, it now resembled a giant, caffeine-scented prison. Federal forces completely encircled the city, their lines tightening like a noose. No one got in, no one got out except for the occasional spy, smuggler, or very determined pigeon. The rebel fighters, exhausted and malnourished, were running on sheer willpower and the faint hope that anything might change. That hope was fading fast. Most soldiers hadn't received proper rations in weeks. Instead of hearty meals, they subsisted on bitter coffee and whatever scraps they could find. Some units joked that they were now part of the Bean Brigade, fueled entirely by caffeine and rage. Others were too tired to joke at all. Civilian life had descended into quiet despair. Shops were shuttered, streets eerily silent except for the occasional clatter of distant gunfire. Families huddled in basements, trying to drown out the booming of federal artillery with whispered prayers. Once vibrant cafes now served as makeshift shelters, their counters piled not with pastries but with sandbags. It was a bitter irony. The very drink that symbolized São Paulo's wealth and identity was now the only thing keeping its people awake through the nightmare. The federal army continued its methodical advance. They weren't just fighting a military campaign, they were waging psychological warfare. Every move was designed to break the rebel spirit. Loudspeakers blared propaganda messages day and night, promising mercy to those who surrendered. Leaflets fluttered down like snow, offering safe passage to defectors and depicting Vargas as a benevolent father figure. These tactics worked disturbingly well. Defections increased daily. Small groups of rebel soldiers slipped across the lines under cover of darkness, hands raised high, desperate for food and safety. Each defection weakened the rebellion further, both militarily and emotionally. Those who stayed behind began to wonder if they were just prolonging the inevitable. The rebel leadership was in chaos. In a cramped, smoky room somewhere beneath the city, São Paulo's top generals and politicians argued over what to do next. Some demanded an immediate ceasefire to spare the civilians. Others insisted that surrender would mean humiliation and the end of São Paulo's political influence forever. Their debates grew so heated that they reportedly had to be separated by armed guards at one point. One bizarre historical footnote emerged from these meetings. A map of the city used for strategic planning was actually an old coffee trade route chart with battle plans hastily drawn over it. This led to constant confusion. At one point, a commander ordered his troops to secure the northern roasting district, only to realize he'd sent them to a literal coffee warehouse instead of the intended defensive line. The mix-up became legendary among the rank and file, who sarcastically nicknamed it Operation Cappuccino. Vargas, meanwhile, played his role perfectly. He remained calm, almost cold, throughout the siege. From his headquarters in Rio, he issued carefully worded statements emphasizing national unity and the need to end this regrettable internal discord. Behind the scenes, however, he was uncompromising. His orders to the federal generals were clear: crush the rebellion completely, but do it slowly, methodically, and with as little collateral damage as possible, at least on paper. The federal army's patience paid off. By late October, they had captured every rail junction leading into the city. Supply lines were gone. Ammunition was critically low. Rebel soldiers were reduced to rationing their last bullets, sometimes down to a single shot per man. One eyewitness recalled seeing fighters carrying rifles but no ammunition, their weapons reduced to little more than clubs. Civilians were also reaching their breaking point. Hunger riots erupted in several neighborhoods, quickly suppressed by rebel militias. Rumors spread wildly in the vacuum of information. Some claimed that foreign powers were preparing to intervene on São Paulo's behalf. Others whispered that Vargas had already agreed to a secret peace deal. None of it was true, but in a city on edge, even the wildest rumor gained traction. Historians still argue over whether São Paulo could have held out longer if they had switched tactics earlier. Some suggest that guerrilla warfare in the countryside might have prolonged the conflict. Others point out that the rebels simply didn't have the resources for a long-term fight, no matter how clever their strategy. One undeniable fact: the people of São Paulo were paying the highest price. With food almost gone, families resorted to extreme measures. Pets disappeared mysteriously. Gardens were stripped bare in some areas. Children survived on a thin porridge made from coffee grounds and boiled water. Survivors later described it as the most bitter meal imaginable, but at least it was warm. And yet, amidst the suffering, there were moments of strange humanity. Federal and rebel soldiers occasionally met unofficially in no man's land to trade goods or share news. These encounters were dangerous and unofficial, but they offered brief reprieves from the relentless hostility. One story tells of a federal soldier giving a rebel his last piece of bread, saying simply, "War ends, hunger doesn't." As October drew to a close, everyone knew the end was imminent. Even the most die-hard rebel leaders had begun drafting surrender terms, though they kept this secret from their troops. Outwardly, they still spoke of victory and perseverance. Inwardly, they were already planning how to save what little remained of São Paulo's honor. The city itself seemed to sense its fate. Fires smoldered in abandoned districts. The once bustling coffee markets were silent, their stalls empty. A witness described the scene in haunting terms. It was as if the city had already surrendered, and only the men with guns hadn't received the message yet. In these final days, the rebellion became less about winning and more about choosing how to lose. Would São Paulo go down in a blaze of defiance, or would it bow its head and live to rebuild another day? The answer would come soon, delivered not with a bang, but with a bitter, exhausted sigh. As October gave way to November, São Paulo stood on the edge of total collapse. The city was no longer a battleground in the traditional sense. It was a slow-motion implosion, a place where hunger and exhaustion fought alongside bullets and bombs. Federal forces didn't even need to storm the city at this point. They simply waited, letting starvation and despair do most of the work. Inside São Paulo, the rebellion was in its death throes. Entire districts had fallen silent except for the occasional burst of gunfire or the eerie wail of distant artillery. Even the constant smell of coffee, once so comforting, had turned oppressive. It hung over the city like a mocking reminder of everything the rebels had hoped to protect. The rebel army was a shadow of its former self. Units that had once numbered in the thousands were now reduced to a few dozen men. Many of them wounded or too weak to fight. Their uniforms were tattered, their rifles battered. Ammunition was practically non-existent. Some soldiers carried empty weapons purely for the sake of appearances, hoping to intimidate federal troops long enough to bluff their way through another day. There was also the problem of sheer physical exhaustion. Many rebels hadn't slept properly in weeks. With coffee as their only reliable stimulant, they were trapped in a vicious cycle, wide-eyed alertness followed by jittery crashes, then stumbling back into battle half delirious. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers to hallucinate, mistaking allies for enemies or worse, mistaking stray dogs for federal scouts. One soldier later confessed, "I once saluted a goat because I thought it was my commanding officer." Meanwhile, Vargas's federal army was at peak strength. Reinforcements continued to pour in, and their supply lines functioned like clockwork. Federal troops were well fed, well armed, and increasingly confident. They knew victory was inevitable. The only debate among Vargas's generals was how to wrap things up without completely destroying São Paulo in the process. A burned out ruin would be politically embarrassing, even if it was militarily decisive. Negotiations were quietly underway. Federal envoys and rebel representatives met in secret locations, trying to hammer out surrender terms. These talks were fraught with mistrust. The rebels wanted guarantees that their leaders wouldn't be executed or exiled. Vargas, ever the strategist, kept his language deliberately vague. He offered national reconciliation and a return to order, phrases that could mean almost anything depending on who was listening. Outside these hushed negotiations, the ordinary people of São Paulo were just trying to survive. Families scavenged for food in the ruins of markets. Children played war games with sticks because real toys were long gone. Civilians who dared to venture out risked being caught in crossfire or mistaken for enemy spies. In some neighborhoods, unofficial truces sprang up. Federal and rebel soldiers, exhausted and hungry, would silently agree to stop shooting for a few hours so both sides could rest. These fragile pauses were never officially acknowledged, but they saved lives all the same. One of the most bizarre incidents of the entire war occurred during this period. A rebel unit, desperate for food, raided what they thought was a federal supply depot. In the dark, they seized crates and hurried back to their lines, only to discover they'd stolen nothing but sacks of green coffee beans. Lacking the resources to roast them, they tried to eat the raw beans whole. The result was so disgusting that even starving men spit them out, swearing that they'd rather starve than try it again. The episode became known among the troops as the Battle of the Bitter Beans. Historians still argue over whether Vargas deliberately prolonged the siege to teach São Paulo a lesson. Some believe he wanted the rebellion to collapse from within so that his victory would seem total and indisputable. Others argue that Vargas was genuinely cautious, afraid that a direct assault would lead to catastrophic urban fighting. Whatever his motives, the effect was the same. The rebels were slowly ground down until they could barely stand. By early November, federal forces were preparing for a final push. Their artillery rained down on the remaining rebel positions with relentless precision. Each day, another neighborhood fell. Rebel commanders sent increasingly frantic messages to their political leaders, pleading for reinforcements that didn't exist. The final straw came when a large group of rebel soldiers attempted to defect en masse. Starving and demoralized, they crossed into federal lines, waving white flags made from bed sheets. The sight shattered whatever morale remained among the defenders. It was now painfully clear the rebellion was finished. Inside the rebel command, the mood shifted from defiance to grim resignation. Even the hardliners who had once vowed to fight to the last man were silent now, staring at maps that no longer meant anything. One general reportedly said, "We are not planning battles anymore. We are planning exits." Vargas's negotiators delivered their final terms, unconditional surrender. but with promises of clemency for ordinary soldiers and a vague assurance that São Paulo's political role would be respected in the future. It wasn't much, but it was better than total annihilation. The rebel leaders gathered one last time to vote. The debate was short. They all knew what had to be done. As dawn broke on November 2nd, they sent word to Vargas São Paulo would surrender. When the news spread through the city, the reaction was strangely muted. There were no cheers, no riots, no dramatic final speeches. Civilians were simply too tired to care. Some wept quietly, others brewed a last pot of coffee with their remaining beans, as if to mark the end of the rebellion with a bitter toast. The federal troops entered the city cautiously, unsure whether to expect resistance. Instead, they found silence. Rebels laid down their arms, filing past federal soldiers with hollow eyes. Many were barefoot. Some carried their rifles like heavy, useless relics. The war was over not with a climactic battle, but with a quiet, exhausted surrender. The morning of November 2nd, 1932 dawned gray and silent. The sky over São Paulo choked with smoke and ash. For 3 long months, the city had been the heart of a rebellion that was as passionate as it was doomed. Now, with the federal army poised on every side, the final chapter was about to be written. At dawn, rebel leaders met one last time in their cramped underground headquarters. There were no fiery speeches now, no dramatic declarations about democracy or honor, just tired men hunched over a battered table, sipping bitter coffee from tin cups. A few weeks earlier, they had argued and shouted about tactics. Today, their voices were low, almost defeated. The decision was already made. Though none of them wanted to say it aloud, the rebellion was over. The official surrender message was drafted quickly. It offered no conditions, only a plea for mercy toward the civilian population and ordinary soldiers. When the final draft was read aloud, there was a heavy silence. One general muttered, "So much for liberty." Another added grimly, "At least there will be food." Then, without ceremony, the message was dispatched to Vargas's headquarters. When news of the surrender began to spread, São Paulo reacted with eerie quiet. There were no bells, no gunshots, no celebrations. People simply slumped where they stood, too weary to cheer or protest. Families embraced in relief. Others wept silently. Some brewed a final pot of coffee, sipping it slowly as if to mark the end of the rebellion with a symbolic farewell. Federal troops entered the city cautiously, expecting ambushes or last-minute resistance. Instead, they were met by lines of rebel soldiers laying down their weapons. Many were barefoot, their clothes ragged, their faces hollow with hunger. Some carried rifles that hadn't been fired in days for lack of ammunition. Federal officers were struck by how young many of the rebels were teenagers, barely old enough to shave, now beaten and broken by a war they hadn't truly understood. One federal officer later wrote in his diary, "It was like walking through a graveyard of dreams. These boys thought they were building a new future. Instead, they built their own ruin." The surrender ceremony itself was brief and almost anticlimactic. A handful of rebel leaders signed the documents in a plain government building, while Vargas's representatives looked on with carefully neutral expressions. The federal negotiators were polite, even cordial, but there was no mistaking who held the power. The rebellion ended not with a bang, but with a weary shuffle of papers. For the citizens of São Paulo, the immediate aftermath was about survival. Federal troops distributed food and medical supplies, and for many civilians, it was the first proper meal they'd seen in weeks. Relief mingled with resentment. Some residents viewed the federal soldiers as liberators, others saw them as conquerors. Most were simply grateful to be alive. The fate of the rebel leaders was a delicate matter. Vargas understood that harsh punishment could reignite tensions, but leniency might be seen as weakness. In the end, he opted for a calculated middle path. Many rebel officers were quietly exiled or stripped of their positions. A few were imprisoned, though none were executed. Ordinary soldiers were granted amnesty and sent home, provided they swore loyalty to the federal government. Historians still debate Vargas's motives. Some believe he genuinely wanted to heal the nation, while others argue he was playing the long game, removing his enemies while appearing magnanimous. What's certain is that the end of the rebellion cemented Vargas's control over Brazil. The old coffee with milk political system was gone for good, replaced by a centralized government with Vargas at its center. In the weeks that followed, life in São Paulo began to creep back toward normalcy, though the scars of war were everywhere. Burned-out buildings lined the streets. Families mourned and lost sons and fathers. The once thriving coffee industry struggled to rebuild, its warehouses half empty, its trade routes shattered. Yet even amidst the ruins, there were glimmers of resilience. Cafes reopened, serving small cups of strong coffee to weary patrons. Newspapers began publishing again, cautiously reporting on the new political order. Children played in the streets, their laughter mingling with the distant rumble of reconstruction work. Over time, the rebellion became a story, a cautionary tale told with equal parts pride and regret. Some remembered it as a noble fight for democracy, others as a foolish gamble by arrogant elites. Historians still argue about its meaning, dissecting every decision and misstep. One thing everyone agreed on, the war had left Brazil changed forever. It was no longer a nation divided neatly between coffee barons and milk producers. It was a country learning, painfully, to redefine itself. For those who had lived through the siege, the memories never faded. Decades later, survivors could still recall the sound of artillery, the smell of roasted beans scattered across the streets, the sight of young soldiers stumbling home in defeat. And so, with the final shot fired and the last pot of coffee drained, the Brazilian coffee revolt ended not in triumph or glory, but in exhaustion and reflection. Now, as we step away from the smoke-filled streets of 1932 São Paulo, let's take a deep breath. The cannons are silent, the shouting has faded, the city, though battered and scarred, is at peace again. It's strange to think how quickly war can turn ordinary places into nightmares and how quickly those same places can return to normal once the fighting stops. The markets will reopen, the trains will run again. Children will grow up not knowing the hunger or fear their parents endured. Life has a way of creeping back, even through the cracks left by destruction. The Brazilian coffee revolt might seem almost absurd in hindsight, a civil war sparked by politics and pride, fought with trains, sacks of beans, and more than a few comical mistakes. But for the people who lived it, it was deadly serious. Families were torn apart, dreams were shattered, and a nation's future hung in the balance. As you imagine São Paulo slowly rebuilding, picture the people sweeping rubble from the streets, planting gardens where trenches once ran, and brewing coffee not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a simple act of daily life. There's something quietly profound in that transformation. Wars like this one remind us that history is rarely neat or logical. It's messy, unpredictable, sometimes tragic, sometimes ridiculous. And when it's over, what remains is not just the story of battles and leaders, but the resilience of ordinary people who find ways to carry on. So tonight, let that final image settle in your mind, a city at rest, a pot of coffee brewing in a quiet kitchen, and a world slowly, steadily finding its way back to peace. End of script.